Hello, everybody. You ready to go? Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome as you're all entering. I think we'll go ahead and get started today. It's about time. I'm Mark Tallman with the Kansas Association of School Boards. My co-presenters today are Leah Fleiter and Scott Rothschild. We're, as usual, just going to divide up the program. Leah's running our PowerPoint. So Leah, if you want to move to the first slide, and I think Leah, you put together the agenda and maybe going first. So why don't you take it away?
That's right, I did. Thanks, Mark. First thing we're going to touch on is our KASB Legislative Committee report. If you are new to our viewership or new to our association, every year KASB develops proposed policy language that Mark and I use in Topeka and in Washington, D.C. to lobby your elected representatives and the State Board of Education. This year, that committee is chaired by KASB past President Shannon Kimball of the Lawrence School District. And you are represented on our legislative committee by a regional representative that you can find at the link I have provided here on this slide. And the other regions, in addition to the KASB geographic regions, are the 5 largest school districts by population. So just a quick rundown there of what the legislative committee does as we get ready to discuss what they have done most recently. Legislative committee met on Saturday, August 29th via Zoom and discussed a proposed state issues platform that focuses on the most pressing issues that you all are facing now in the COVID-19 era. And it connects that proposed platform not only with the State Department's goals for students and their success, but also to the KASB pathways that we have been using for the past couple of years to track and organize our efforts, both in the advocacy front, but also in our leadership and programming fronts. And that proposed document will be shared with the general membership soon at our regional roundtables, which you have probably seen a very entertaining video out on social media about those regional roundtables that are coming up at the end of September, beginning of October. It will give all of you the chance to review that draft state issues document and give feedback before the committee meets again in November. In November, the committee will turn not only to the state document and finalizing that based on your input, they will also turn their attention to our federal legislative document and any proposed changes there, which we will then kick out to you again in November in preparation for the KASB convention in December. So before I move on, are there any questions on the KASB Legislative Committee or its report that you all will see soon? All right, I'll move on then. Mark, I believe this is your slide.
Okay, I will do that. And just to echo what Leah said, as we go through, if you have questions, because I think everyone is currently muted, signal in the chat or use your raise your hand feature. We will keep watching that. You're always welcome to ask questions as we go, but we'll try to stop from time to time and then have a little bit of time at the end to wrap things up. I'm going to start by some developments just this past week. The Legislative Post-Audit Committee, which is a group of legislators that supervises the Legislative Division of Post Office, met to receive 2 new reports. Most of you are probably familiar with the concept of legislative post-audit. They're a group of professionals that are employed by the legislature to undertake studies and audits of state programs, finances, and other public policy questions. On Wednesday, the committee received several audits, but 2 of them concern K-12 education. One is on bilingual funding, and one was about kind of the general issue of publicly funded lobbying through association membership and lobbying, which is done by those groups, and that includes KASB, could include other organizations, and I will talk about that in a minute. So Leah, if you want to turn to the next slide. The probably major audit that we'll be looking at is a study of bilingual education funding. So when the legislature several years ago adopted a school finance formula that kind of restored the old law, made some changes, and responded to the Gannon decision, part of that law set forth a 10-year cycle of audits that the post-audit committee would do. They've got a group of specialists in school funding. And so every year they've been looking at a different feature of the school finance formula. I think they started with transportation. They looked at special education. They looked last year at risk, which you might remember raised some issues because they disagreed with how the State Department of Education is sort of interpreting and operating that program. Ultimately did not lead to any changes in legislation, but that's partly because the legislature ended. And this year they were looking at bilingual education. To do that, they selected 25 districts, and I'm going to briefly go over this is the summary of their findings. One is that just as they have in the past, they found that most districts spend more money on these programs than is provided in state aid. Last year, the state provided $42 million through the bilingual weighting. Now, not all of your districts may get that because if you don't have bilingual students or services, you don't receive that funding. But if you do, you share in about $42 million. And the number of kids that it served is about 10 or 11% of the state. So it's a fairly substantial number of students receive these services. For a student to generate this funding and get the services, the district must find that he or she is not proficient in English. You're required under federal law to provide these services, but how you do it is up to the district. And as we indicated, state funding covered about 68% of the total dollars that the 25 districts reviewed provided. Next slide, Leah. They have found that most of the money, and this is no surprise, goes to salaries and benefits of staff who serve these students, generally to provide teachers and aides. They did find that about 6% of the money spent by these districts was not directly attributable to an ESOL program required by state law. This may well have been something that when it was audited by the Department of Education might have had the district do something with that. They did not raise a big issue with that. They generally found that districts were complying, and they found that the State Department of Education was calculating funding correctly and providing with state law. So no, they didn't find any problems in how the program operates. But if you move to the next slide, Leah, there were a couple of other issues that they did raise that certainly could generate some legislative interest. One thing they found is that ESOL students typically take 5 to 8 years to complete the program. This has been an issue in the legislature, but the auditor said this is very consistent with other states. They also said that after students exit these programs, they generally do not score as well on state assessments as all students. So I'm guessing this will raise some questions about, well, are these programs any good if students complete them and they still fall behind? What the audit didn't say is whether they have disaggregated these kids on other grounds. My guess is, and I don't know, this wasn't part of the audit, but that many of the students who were in these programs have other factors that might continue to keep them at risk. For example, they may be more likely to be low-income students. Coming out of a program does not necessarily deal with all the issues that may cause students to not do well. Program just didn't go into that level of detail. When they interviewed the districts in that were part of this survey, they said there were a number of challenges. One of them, of course, is just finding qualified staff. Another is the fact that what many people don't understand is this is not just you have to teach someone Spanish. There is a wide variety of languages and dialects, and it can be very, very challenging for districts to serve the number of districts or the number of languages that they have to deal with. The report also said that while many districts track individual student process, they did not find that most districts regularly evaluated the effectiveness of their program. So again, I think that's something the legislature might look at. And finally, they said that state law is pretty vague on how to spend the money, but that the State Department of Education does provide guidance, and they found that districts were generally following that guidance. So overall, a pretty good bill of health in terms of the operation of this program. Certainly ongoing concerns about the effectiveness. This is another of those issues where we all know we have big gaps among different types of students, and as districts try to respond to those gaps are continuing, and that's going to continue to be looked at. So any questions anyone wants to put in right now about the bilingual program before I briefly talk about the other audit? Pause just a minute and see if anyone wants to start chatting. We can come back to that. So, okay, let's go to the next one. And the second audit was done because some legislators want to look at how much public funding is being spent on lobbying. By public funding, we mean lobbying by either state agencies, the state itself, or any public subdivisions of the state like school districts, cities, counties, and others. A couple of issues came out. One is that lobbying is very specifically defined in state law as actions to support or oppose government action or inaction. Not everyone that lobbies, and I obviously misspelled that, I don't know what lobby is, but if you lobby, you are, in many cases, you do not have to register or report. There's a definition, thank you, Leah, of people who are like, well, Leah and I, who's been kind of are appointed or employed to lobby, are required to register. Not everyone is. If you are a registered lobbyist, you are required annually to report public funds you receive for lobbying. That's really all the law says. We at KASB report a portion of our salaries that we try to estimate how much of all the job responsibilities we have meet the actual definition of lobbying. We do this with advice from the Governmental Ethics Division. Not all of what we do under the general heading of governmental relations meets that definition. For example, we are arguably involved today in governmental relations because we're informing our members about this audit, but we're not advocating any action or action by the legislature. So we would not consider the time that we spend in activities like this to be lobbying. Well, there are those that may disagree with that. And so I suspect that there may be discussions in the legislature by folks who might say, well, you're not reporting everything you're doing or spending because you're only taking, a small amount of that. But again, to our knowledge, we are complying with the law. In fact, I spoke yesterday with a representative of the Governmental Ethics Commission who said they agree with our methodology, but that doesn't mean the law might not be changed. Finally, we expect to see some legislative concern. Oh, I'm sorry, Leah. One more point is that to find out that they're also interested in asking public entities if they spend money on dues and fees and memberships to organizations or individuals that lobby. So they surveyed literally thousands of public entities. Only about 25% responded. Now, school districts did better, but only about half of school districts even responded to this survey. And so of those that did respond and report dollars they spent, most of those went to statewide organizations like KASB. But that includes dues and fees for all services, not just lobbying. So again, there's kind of a discrepancy between reports that may say, $1.3 million went to KASB, which lobbies, but only a small portion of that did we report as lobbying. So we don't really know where this is going, but you may hear questions and issues about this. We wanted to report it. So again, Leah, you can go to the next slide. We'll pause just a moment to see whether there are any questions that want to come up at this time. Not seeing any in the chat. Again, we'll keep an eye on that, but I think I'm now going to turn it over to Scott to talk about another entity which met in the last couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. Last week, the Governor's Council on Tax Reform met, and to just kind of review, this was a bipartisan panel appointed by Governor Laura Kelly. And basically, the council is charged with finding or making recommendations to the legislature to make Kansas's tax system a little bit more modern, maybe more fair, and more sustainable. It's chaired by, it's got a bipartisan chairmanships, Steve Morris, former Senate President, Janice Lee, Democrat and former state senator, and our own Shannon Kimball, past president of KASB and still a Lawrence School Board member, is on that council. And the reason we kind of bird dog this council is because, you know, obviously tax policies are going to affect the revenues, which obviously will affect our funding. Just to kind of recap from last last session, the major recommendations of this council, they wanted to, they had a bill to tax digital products, such as digital books, newspaper, magazine subscriptions, things of that sort. It would have brought in about $50 million. Also, this is seen as a fairness kind of issue. You buy a book at the dusty bookshelf, I think you pay a sales tax, but if you buy it on your Kindle, you don't. Another thing they had was Kansas requires out-of-state retailers to collect and remit sales taxes, but it doesn't require marketplace facilitators such as Amazon to do so. And depending on who you believe, we are either the only state or maybe only one of a handful of states that does not do this. And if we were to do this, the revenue estimate is that we would reap about $30 million a year, $30 to $35 million a year. The group also recommended a food sales tax refundable tax credit for low to moderate income Kansans. This was something that was done away with during the Brownback years to help offset the revenue losses that were incurred with his large tax cuts. And this would cost the state approximately $50 million a year. This also figures into the ever-present debate about the sales tax on food. Removing the sales tax on food would be a large hit to the state treasury. And so the council thought this was a more directed approach to help low to moderate income Kansans. Well, none of these things moved. I mean, I think there were hearings on some of these bills. There maybe it was some committee action, but nothing came out of either chamber on any of these proposals. And, the reason, obviously the session was cut short because of the pandemic. And obviously dealing with tax issues as you're coming into a campaign season could be problematic for in your political aspirations. So the council is probably going to pick up the thread on these again and start talking about them. Thank you, Leah. During the meeting, they got a briefing, very nice briefing from the Tax Policy Center, a Washington think tank, nonpartisan think tank, and basically their representatives, all states are suffering because of this pandemic and the recession, and all states are losing. There may be one or two states that have not actually lost revenue, but the overwhelming majority of states are suffering because of this. And here's just a little chart that they provided that shows the percent change. As you can see, Kansas is similar to the United States average, and here's some of our neighboring states too. Yes, thank you. The Tax Policy Center provided some, not recommendations, just some ideas to kick around for maybe recouping some more revenue. I just included a couple that I think are interesting. Well, the one I included was, when we used to have 3 income tax brackets before Brownback tax policies went into effect. And then when we repealed those, we really didn't go back to where we were before. So our top individual tax rate is relatively low compared to a couple of our neighbors. So that might be something to look at. Obviously these are difficult politically, but if you were looking for a progressive kind of tax increase that would affect maybe those who could afford it the most, putting in a top individual income tax bracket that is higher than that 5.7% may be something to consider. Next slide, please. You know, there was also testimony from Dr. Donna Ginther with the University of Kansas. And this is just a very short summation of, she had a very in-depth presentation, but, you know, I think most of us think the economy is kind of rebounding. We're kind of coming out of this, but there are still very great needs out there. As you can read from this slide, 1/3 of Kansan households with children are behind on their rent. You know, half of Kansas counties are looking at large increases in TANF recipients and SNAP benefits. So obviously there's a lot of pain out there, and you know, this affects our economy. Most importantly, it affects our families who are sending their children to our schools, and this kind of all bubbles up. So the Tax Policy Council is, I don't know if I mentioned, but you know, we will keep following this. Their recommendations should be out probably by the end of the year. State Budget Director Larry Campbell pretty much told them the governor starts putting her budget proposal for the next session together on December 2nd. He had an exact date, which I thought was interesting. And so I think he was kind of hinting to them to get their stuff in order. Steve Morris, one of the chairmen, said, you know, they plan to meet maybe 3, 4, 5 more times. And I think they're going to pick up with a lot of the recommendations that they had from last session. There seems to be some consensus around the low income, the refundable tax credit, and perhaps modernizing our sales tax a bit, expanding the base. We've been talking about that for, I don't know, decades, but you know, the sales tax was put into place in 1937 because that's when we used to buy stuff. Now we buy services, and we really don't tax that very well. So that tax council is something we'll keep an eye on. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat.
Okay, if no more questions, I think we'll move on. Our next brief update is going to be on the SPARK program and round 3 funding. As most of you probably know, the state has received several $1 billion from the federal government to help compensate for some of the economic impacts of the COVID pandemic. And the SPARK task force, which is strengthening, I'm not going to say that right, so I think you all generally know what the SPARK task force is. It's a group that is advising the state on how to spend the money that we have received from the federal government. And it is now looking at round 3 funding priorities, and it met on September 2nd. These are the priorities that the group is kind of coalescing around. That the most critical needs are in public health, essential needs and services, and business resilience. And then the more long-term but less immediately critical needs are focusing around education and connectivity. The group noted that education and connectivity, in other words, broadband, have already received some SPARK funding, some CARES Act funding. They will likely receive more, but the committee felt that the priorities were likely to fall out around public health, which is I think a big concern is making COVID testing more widespread and making testing of asymptomatic individuals more widespread, and then focusing on some essential needs and services such as unemployment relief and also eviction protection. So as I mentioned, a big concern is expanding testing coverage, working on the 25% of low-income Kansans who are concerned about food security, the about 8% of our fellow citizens who are concerned they won't be able to pay their next month's rent, and of course, unemployment remains at 7.2%. So those are kind of the unmet needs that the SPARK task force is looking at, and they are scheduled to finalize kind of the program areas on September 10th. For some fairly robust discussion on September 2nd about the need for, as I mentioned earlier, widespread testing of asymptomatic individuals. There was a discussion of how many of the testing results that we've seen so far are in connection to an outbreak, especially perhaps in a specific location. But that's how communities are basing their school reopening and other decisions based on that testing. And so there is discussion about more widespread testing. I think there's something like 4,000 more tests that will soon be made available. And there was pressure to have that be applied to asymptomatic folks to give us a better read on how the virus is spreading in the communities. And there was also quite a bit of discussion about the critical role of childcare in business resilience. I think those of you, if you are in a business or if you are in the business of running schools, you know that parents rely on schools for childcare, and if their children are not school aged, they also depend on private childcare providers for that childcare when the parents have to remain at work or return to work as businesses have reopened as the pandemic has played out. So that is definitely an issue that we will be paying attention to, and the task force will meet again to prioritize those needs. Are there any questions on this very brief SPARK overview before we move on to the 2020 census? Okay, well, the time is now. Respond today. The deadline for responding to the 2020 U.S. Census is at the end of this month, September 30th. As you probably know, the census helps determine $6 billion in federal funding to Kansas, including for Title I, special education, school nutrition, job training. A number of critically important programs in Kansas depend on an accurate census count. Our parent organization, the National School Boards Association, and several other national advocacy groups are pushing for the national government to extend that deadline at least through the end of the calendar year of 2020, but we've not seen any concrete action on that as yet. I was presenting at the USA conference last Friday talking about the census, and I had a question from a superintendent about, how can I check my county response rate so that I can communicate with our patrons about the importance of responding to the census. I provided you a link there at the bottom of the screen where you can click on your county. I used Riley County as an example because that's my home county, and I can see that currently our 2020 response rate is about 62.5% total, and our 2010 self-response rate was 69.3. So obviously need to make some progress there. As you can see, Riley County is in kind of the light blue, which is the higher, the higher response rates. And then I just picked kind of one of the western Kansas counties that is marked in yellow as having a lower response rate. That response rate for Rush County is at 49% right now, or 50% if you round up. Their final 2010 response rate was 63.9%. So you can see that there are communities and counties across the state that are seriously lagging in their census response. And those of you who represent those counties or perhaps have friends in those counties should really urge those folks to respond to the census as soon as they can, and certainly before September 30th. The census folks are encouraging any kind of sort of creative response that you can apply to getting out census information to your patrons. Folks have used pickup and drop off of meal pickups or supply pickup events to hand out census information. If you have some community events coming up, maybe you're even going to have your first high school football game of the season. Perhaps you could distribute information there or encourage people to respond to the census. Or if you have community events coming up, if you have Labor Day parades or homecoming parades or any other sort of activities like that to perhaps encourage people to respond to the census by the end of September. Any questions about the census? All right. Okay, we're going to touch on some current issues that we're following. And if you watch this, you know you're probably getting tired of me talking about this every 2 weeks. But the broadband or homework gap issue in the state of Kansas, we know that about 156,000 Kansas students now do not have reliable home internet access. For the pandemic, that number was at about 70,000 kids, so it's more than doubled. And we know that as schools are looking at possible hybrid models for this 2020-21 school year, and some have already opted to go fully remote, broadband access is an issue, whether you're in a rural area of the state that doesn't have service or in a more urban area of the state where we may have families who cannot afford broadband internet. The Spark Committee has approved $60 million in connectivity funding for broadband access in Kansas, which is really great news, and $10 million of that is for outreach to needy families. Of course, the challenge with Spark funding is that those projects have to be completed by the end of December 2020, so just a few short months. And when we're talking about building out broadband access, that can be fairly complicated and time-consuming. So that's an issue that we are continuing to advocate on for our members, and we'll keep you updated on that topic. Any questions on broadband or the homework gap? Okay. And we're also following a number of special committees that are meeting. The first one we're going to touch on is the Special Committee on the Kansas Emergency Management Act. As you may know, that law was enacted several years ago and really did not, we found as the pandemic hit our state, that it probably needs to be modernized to reflect a statewide emergency such as a pandemic. In the group's first meeting last week, the House K-12 Education Budget Chair suggested that in the future, the emergency management law should allow private schools to remain open during a health emergency. She suggested that parents be provided vouchers to pay for alternate education for their children at a private school if their public school district decides to go to online only instruction during a health epidemic. And she also suggested codification of some of the remote learning guidance and other guidance that the State Board of Education has issued in its Navigating Change document around instruction and also around accountability for the 1,116 mandated contact hours for that constitute an official school year. So we're keeping tabs on that issue for you, and the next meeting of that committee is September 22nd through the 24th. And special programming note, the committee is chaired by Representative Fred Patton, who is a former KASB president. So a good perspective there for the committee chair. Any questions on that Emergency Management Act committee? All right, I think we'll move on. Mark, I believe you've been covering the foster care committee.
Yeah, a couple of committees that I've also been covering, several that also met last week that we did not have a chance to report to at the last meeting. One is a special committee on foster care oversight, had its first meeting. That mostly was provided to the group with an overview of the foster care system. State officials did offer that some progress has been made. As some of you may know, over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a much larger growth in the number of students in state custody than growth in the student population. That has really taxed the system and created a lot of problems. You've probably heard about issues of students having to sleep in the offices because they can't find placement. The state was sued by a group but they are showing some numbers are going down. They announced a possible settlement of that lawsuit. So those are good news. One thing that the committee was briefed on was Governor Kelly's executive order creating an education report card that when it is produced, and the state shared kind of a mock-up, and it's going to show basically kids in foster care do not do well on education outcomes. That probably isn't very surprising, but it is troubling. One of the things I would note is, on average, there are about 5,000 students in state custody of foster care every year. That would be one of the larger school districts in the state if those kids were all together. And one of the problems that always comes up is the issue of coordinating. School districts are kind of designed to serve well the group of kids that you have on an ongoing basis. Often foster care students are moved into a different placement, and many of the concerns we hear about has to do with how you transfer records and how you place those kids for services. And a big issue is how you give credit toward graduation. And that's one reason there is such a low graduation rate. And of course, that has lifelong consequences. So I expect that this committee is going to look at some of those issues, and how we respond to that, both in terms of policy and what districts do at the local level, is going to get heightened attention. The committee is going to meet again in September and October to continue to look at the whole system, but we expect education will be part of that. Leah, another committee is looking at mental health issues. Their first meeting was last week. It is designed to look at the whole system of mental health services in the state. Once again, much broader than education, but education was talked about. Some of you may know that several years ago, the legislature created a pilot program to have school-based mental health services. That is really a partnership between school mental health liaisons and services provided through community mental health programs. This program has grown, but it is limited by funding, so not all districts could get involved. And I think the feeling is it can only grow so fast because there's a limited number of people who are licensed in the state to fill these roles. So one of the things that the legislature has been talking about is the structure of that program in terms of how, do you have to partner with a local community? Does the school have to run it? Are there other ways to provide these services? So all that we got, excuse me, at that point was kind of a look at the program in its first 2 years and how we expect it to operate in this year starting now. There are some promising results because the programs have to track what has happened of students in the program, what is happening to their academic progress, what is happening to their attendance and discipline. And there do seem to be some positive responses. I think there's a question. So what is happening at this point? The state did provide ongoing funding that will allow a larger number of districts and kids to be served this year, but you had to be selected to get those grants. The future, it is at this point still sort of a grant basis. So any year, the legislature could stop that funding. At this point, I think it's still a pretty popular program. We don't know about the growth, and we don't know whether there will be some effort to move it into a kind of weighting system or continue to operate. Those are the things that was being discussed last session, and the session, as you know, ended abruptly before they made any change. So the money that had been recommended was appropriated to the Department of Education. They went ahead and made their round of grants. Beyond that, we don't know what the future holds, Dale, and that could be part of what this committee could talk about. They will meet again October 5th, October 30th, and December 10th and 11th. Next slide. Another issue, another committee that is meeting, that was appointed, is the Special Committee on Economic Recovery. Does not have a direct education impact, but it is certainly going to be looking at things like tax policy, which has an impact on state budget and therefore funding. And I would suspect, although it was not really brought up, the ongoing question of school opening and what that does to the workforce will be discussed. We've not at this time heard any particular programs, but certainly there is a belief that if schools are not open and are not providing that custodial care, it makes it difficult for some parents to return to the workforce, and that can have a negative impact on economic recovery and employment. Of course, the other side of that is making sure that those kids can come back to a safe environment and that their parents will have that confidence. So a lot of intertwined issues as a part of this. There is 2 more meeting dates planned for this committee. And the next slide. This is just a note that I guess I want to continue to think we need as educators to be aware of what the impact of COVID on education. What is it doing to enrollment? What is it doing to at-risk numbers and the budget implication of that? Is it having an effect on your staffing, transportation needs? All of these could kind of ripple through our school finance formula, have impacts on your budget going into the future. And so how the state responds to those, we need to be keeping track of what those are. We've also kind of talked to you about how CARES funding could be used. That's part of what Leah was talking about. And no doubt there's going to be a returned emphasis to learning measures. I saw this week that the U.S. Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, has said, you know, that they expect that we will not provide a waiver of state assessments this year. So we didn't give state assessments in Kansas, and I don't think any other states had to do. They got a general waiver from the U.S. Department of Education. So we're not going to have measures this year on our state assessments. The expectation is those will come back, and we'll begin to see what type of impact, at least on that measure, the time away from school had on different groups. And certainly we expect that the controversy over school closing and reopening is going to have an impact on the school choice debate. Leah talked about one legislator talking about giving kids vouchers if public schools aren't open, to let them have options. The whole question of giving people choices of where and how to get their kids educated. The pandemic is putting that in the spotlight, and we're going to have continued debate around that. Leah, one more slide, and that brings us back to you. So go ahead, federal issues.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to touch briefly on some federal issues we're tracking. As you know, there has been discussion around an additional federal stimulus bill for states and localities, including school districts. The House passed a bill that contains $58 billion in relief funding for K-12 schools. The Senate, U.S. Senate, has proposed $70 billion for K-12. There's an alternate Senate proposal on the table for what they're calling a skinny stimulus that would be sort of a pared down version of the Senate bill that I referred to just a second ago. That continues to have the $70 billion for K-12, but it ties the amount of funding you would receive to your status around reopening in person. If you reopen in person, fully in person, then you get, you know, all the money that your district is entitled to. If you go to hybrid, you only get 50%, and if you open fully online, you get none of that stimulus that is intended to go towards your school district. So those are deliberations, I'll say, that we're following. Our national organizations are advocating for at least $175 billion for public schools. So you can see that the levels are pretty far apart there. Our concerns at this point are that, you know, this stimulus was supposed to be passed and to the president's desk in time for the August recess, which, as you know, it's now September, and Congress is out campaigning and there's no stimulus bill. So the concern now is that this may not pass until the end of September, or it may not even pass as a standalone bill. The stimulus could be rolled into a continuing resolution at the end of September to keep the government open, because the federal government's fiscal year starts on October 1st. And as we've seen over the past several years, there tends to be drama about whether the federal government is going to be able to pay its bills and how that's going to happen. And so every September we have these debates around how to keep the schools open. And so there's concern among some of the observers on Capitol Hill that if a stimulus gets rolled into the continuing resolution, we could lose some key provisions in sort of some trade-offs around who pays for what. Our national organizations have issued an action alert. There's been quite a bit of discussion about vouchers and public schools and their reopening status, particularly at one of the political conventions and by Secretary DeVos in some of her recent rulemakings and comments. So we continue to oppose vouchers being connected to reopening status or to any kind of voucher bills in any kind of stimulus legislation. Any questions about federal topics before we move on? Okay, briefly, if you would like to contact your members of Congress, we have information on our advocacy page about how to contact them either via email or by social media. As always, please be respectful and concise when you're contacting your members of Congress. All right, now we're going to turn to the 2020 election, and I think Scott's going to take over.
Thank you, Leah. This slide, in case you haven't heard, there's an election coming up. And this slide is just has some handy-dandy deadlines and election dates. Obviously, the election is November 3rd. We're coming up to Labor Day this weekend, which is the unofficial start of the campaign season, but you know, it's been going on for a year now already. So, but November 3rd is the election. If you vote by mail-in ballot, those ballots must be postmarked on or before Election Day, and they have to be received by your local election office by the close of business November 6th, which is Friday. And I think in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about mail-in voting. During the August primary, there were an unbelievable increase in the amount of mail-in voting because of, I think it's because of the COVID-19 pandemic. People just didn't want to get out, and they expect this to happen again. And obviously, this has been in the news a lot. So I've never seen so much anxiousness about the actual act of voting, but that's where we're at today. And people are saying, experts are saying, if you're going to do a mail-in ballot, which is perfectly safe, perfectly, safe and natural thing to do, but do it as early as possible because they want when you request the ballot, then the ballot has to come back to you, then you have to mail in the ballot, or you can bring it down to your election office. But this all takes some time. And so the post office is advising you, if you're going to do a mail-in ballot and send it in by mail, do it as early as possible. Next slide, please. I think, KASB, we are all about providing information about education. We're not telling people how to vote, but we want people to be aware of what the issues are. And, when your candidates come into town and you meet them or Zoom with them or however you get in contact with your candidates, please let them know what's going on. I mean, this is just an unprecedented time that we're going through, and it can't be said enough. They need to know what your back to school plan is, what challenges you have faced, what changes you've seen in enrollment, what are students, what are parents, what are teachers worried about, what have you learned, and just share with them information so that they can have a feeling for what you're facing. We have some of this on our website. We have a YouTube video that goes over the major education issues, and it's a podcast also. So we urge you to click on these when you can. They're short, they're sweet, they're succinct. They let you know what the major issues are, and I think will help you when you talk to your candidates. In case you didn't realize it, September 1 was a big day. It was National Poll Worker Recruitment Day. And we at KASB and the other major education groups are teamed up with the Kansas Secretary of State's office to, we're involved in this program called Student Serve, and it is to try to get or encourage high school students to volunteer as poll workers. If you've been to the polls, we think this, this of course instills civic engagement. You might get to know your local election leaders better. It strengthens our democracy if our young people have a better sense of how our government system works. If you've been to polls lately, you've probably noticed the average age is probably my age or even older. And these folks, they, you know, they got to watch themselves now because of this pandemic. So we need some younger people in there. We need to get younger people involved in the election process. And so we have teamed up with the Kansas Secretary of State's office to try to endeavor to do this. Ways we can do this in your schools, you know, you can allow excused absentees for students who volunteer for this. You can provide class credit, invite candidates and local elected officials to speak to your students. Any incentive that you can give to a 16, 17, 18-year-old kid to work at the polls, I think would be to the betterment of our democracy. And this is just for more information on this program. You can contact the Secretary of State's office at that phone number or email that. You know, all you have to be is 16 years old or older to become a poll worker in Kansas, and there is a definite need. If you talk to any elected, if you talk to any county election official, they will tell you they need poll workers. And if, you know, we can get our students in there, it's a great learning experience, and it would really help the state out.
All right, I think we have come to the end of our formal slide presentation. I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other a little bit better and see if we have any questions or comments as we move toward the top of the hour today.
Leah, I think what they're telling us is they want to start their
That's right.
Labor Day weekend. So we can certainly end a little earlier if there aren't any questions. We're seeing some of our thank yous pop up, and that's great, but wait just a moment to see if there are any other questions.
I will post this PowerPoint on our website. If you go to KASB, click on the Advocacy tab, and then look for key resources. I'll post this PowerPoint within the next few minutes.
And as I hope many of you know, all of these are recorded, and we do post these on our YouTube channel. So if you know people that that would benefit from this, that don't have the opportunity to listen and watch, they are available as both a video and podcast on our website and other places. And we will typically continue to do these every first and third Friday until the legislative session begins.